This year at Bios Explorer, we're going to look at the impact of ship groundings around Bermuda.
When people came here 400 years ago, they were wrecking their ships in the reef, affecting the island before they even set foot on land.
Not only 400 years ago, but still to this day.
Oops.
In 2007, a cruise ship ran aground, damaging a large part of Bermuda's reef.
In our experiments this week, we're going to look at how these ship groundings affect the reef and how long-lasting these effects are. Our hypothesis is that there will be fewer fish and less coral cover in the disturbed reef site than the non-disturbed reef site.
We're going to dive and snorkel at a controlled site, which is an undisturbed reef. And then we are going to go to an experimental site, which is a ship grounding site.
Yeah, and at each site, we will count the number of fish and the amount of coral cover.
To count the fish, we are going to use a scientific protocol called the roving diver technique, which is when you get into the water, swim in a certain area for a certain amount of time. But first, before we get into the water, we're going to look at the reef fish book and look at the fish in it to make sure we know which fish that we are taking down. Then we take our clipboard, which is waterproof, and our pencil and tick all the fish that we see.
To measure the amount of coral cover, we'll use one of these, a quadrat. We place this randomly on the reef and then take a photo of it from above. We take the picture back to the boat and count the number of corals on it.
At the grounding site, there was only sand left where the ship had been. And in the rubble along the edge, you can see there is very little coral growth. The second site was the wreck of the Cristobal Colon. Straight away, you can see that there is more coral cover and a lot more fish. Even though a lot of the reef structure had been damaged, it seems that the coral is using the wreck as a substrate to grow on. Up at Hogbreaker, the undisturbed site, the coral has been able to grow up into large formations, and there was a much greater variety of coral species here. There were also loads more fish and lots of different species that we hadn't seen at the other sites. Hey, we're back from the grounding site of the Marybone, the wreck site of the Cristobal Colon, and Hogbreaker. And here's what we found. At the grounding site, we only counted 15 fish. At the shipwreck, we counted 100 fish. And at the natural reef, we counted at least 250 fish. At the grounding site, there was no coral cover. At the shipwreck, there was 26% cover. And at Hogbreaker, the natural reef, we saw a 61% coral cover.
In conclusion, we know that shipwrecks and ship groundings have a very negative effect on the marine environment. From the experiments we did, we know that ever since the Sea Venture ran aground here in Bermuda in 1609, humans have been impacting the environment here.
Okay, so that's 400 years of us changing and often damaging the environment here, either because of our actions or because of the species we've introduced, sometimes accidentally and sometimes on purpose. Oceanic island ecosystems are particularly susceptible to the introduction of invasive species. And that's because island endemics have evolved in isolation without the threats that other species have evolved with. And so new introductions can quickly wipe them out. On oceanic islands, the endemic species are very susceptible to the introduction of pests and also species which outcompete them for their resources. So in order to learn a little bit more about oceanic island ecosystem and these effects, we went to Nonsuch Island to check out what's going on there. The whole idea of Nonsuch Island started really as a restoration site for probably the world's most endangered animal, bird, which is the cahao, or the Bermuda petrel. So 50 years ago, roughly, the cahao was rediscovered and they needed a place for it to be restored. And Nonsuch was chosen as that island. But the project very quickly grew from just a restoration site for the bird into a restoration site, if you will, for all of Bermuda's endemics and all of our native forest. So what we're going to be seeing as we hike around today is a 50-year-old, almost mature native Bermuda forest. If you hike around Bermuda, you're looking at 5% native forest. Most of what you see, most of the plants, most of the animals are things that have been introduced to Bermuda. The opposite is true out here. The canopy we're looking at now, as with native Bermuda forest, 3 backbone species. Right, the shade we're under now is this Bermuda palmetto. We've got an old dead Bermuda cedar here, but now a few replacement cedars are starting to poke through as our emergent layer. And our third endemic species, that's the Bermuda olivewood. If you look at your palmetto here, out of the 100 different palms in Bermuda, this is the only one that's original to Bermuda. It's the only native and in fact an endemic. One of the ways you can tell, a palmetto is one of the only palms that doesn't have spikes and spines on the stalk of the leaf. This has got this really, really solid trunk. It goes down very deeply. It's slow growing. It puts all of its energies into just being this really, really tough tree. After Hurricane Fabian, these guys didn't even look like they'd had a haircut. Barely any branches down. They were just so tough. In deciding to turn Nonsuch into this pre-colonial forest and as a haven for cahaos, the first thing that had to be done was to get rid of the rats. Rats are probably the worst invasive species anywhere in the world. While the parent birds will be out fishing for the little chicks, they're defenseless, and a rat will very quickly kill a cahao chick. So obviously rats had to be taken out of the equation for the cahao restoration, but suddenly all these amazing spin-offs happened, one of which is to do with this tree, which is our third endemic species in Bermuda. This is the Bermuda olivewood. And you'll see some old-timers in Walsingham and a few other places in Bermuda, but even the ones in Walsingham, which drop a lot of fruit, there are just no little seedlings popping up underneath. And now if you look around the understory here, pretty much everywhere you've got little seedlings of olivewoods poking up. In fact, the whole forest floor is just nothing but olivewoods here. And here's the link. As the fruit drops on the mainland, rats just eat it immediately before it can germinate. It's just wiped out. They never give a chance for those seeds to pop up. Here, with no rats, suddenly it's probably the way it would have been 400 or 500 years ago. And the forest floor is just covered in olivewoods. Now, one of the most famous accidental introductions to Bermuda was the scale insect that nearly wiped out all of our cedar trees. Most of the forest was cedars. And of course, the thing with Bermuda cedars is that in the forest, with really deep soil, they'll grow to a very tall tree, tall by Bermuda standards. On the shoreline, with low soil depth and with all the wind and salt, they tend to stay low and stunted. It's kind of sad to look around Nonsuch today and see all of these skeletons. And it must have really been terrifying, I think, World War II era, when the scale insect came to Bermuda and just started to decimate all cedar trees. I mean, it was just like a fire going across Bermuda. They lost, 80 to 90% within 5 or 6 years. And then, of course, once these had died, everything in the understory died out as well. The decision was then made, okay, well, we need something to replace the windbreak and the shade of the cedar tree, and that's when the Australian whispering or whistling pines came in. But you never know. When you're introducing something to an island, what's going to happen? Is it going to be a good introduction, or is it going to spin out of control? And casuarinas seemed great for a while, but there were problems. One of the problems is that they don't stop growing according to the soil depth. And they will just continue growing up and up and up. So even on the shoreline, where all of the well-adapted native plants kind of hunker down low, casuarinas zoop, shoot right up, and when the hurricanes come along, they just get bowled over. And the roots rip up all of that Bermuda limestone, and they seem to be really contributing to erosion along the coast. We've talked a lot about accidental introductions, things like the scale insect that was brought here by mistake, but there have also been a lot of deliberate introductions that have gone horribly wrong. In order to control the numbers of the Mediterranean fruit fly, the Jamaican anole, a type of lizard, was introduced. But instead of targeting the fruit fly, they targeted the ladybird, a natural predator of insect pests. And it also outcompeted the Bermuda skink, forcing it from much of its natural habitat. So, to control the anole, the kiskadee was introduced, an aggressive bird that instead of targeting the anoles, attacked Bermuda's endemic and native birds, like the bluebird, the chick of the village, the cardinal, and the catbird. It also targeted the Bermuda cicada, that due to the loss of the cedar forests and predation from the kiskadee, is now considered to be extinct. This is a case in point where a species has been brought to Bermuda for a purpose, and the jury's still out on whether this is a good thing or not. What I'm looking at here are piles of crab legs. This is what we call a land crab. It's actually a marine crab that the only marine part of its life is when it's actually releasing its eggs. The females will all head down to the sea and they do this little dance in the shore to release their eggs, and then they come back in. When I was growing up, if you were driving along South Shore on your bike in the evenings in the summer, you would suddenly be playing Space Invaders, and there would just be so many crabs darting back and forth on the road. You had to make a lot of nips to try and not squash the crabs. It seems that their only predator would have been an endemic heron. That heron, there are records of the sailors who arrived in Bermuda knocking them out of the trees with big clubs to eat them. And it seems that they didn't have the same luck of the cahao of surviving, and those herons are just dead and gone. We can't prove extinction, but we're pretty sure they are gone. And being that that was the only thing that used to eat the land crabs, the land crab population just started to take off. Now, Bermuda has more golf courses per square mile than anywhere in the world, and you can't really have a worse thing on a golf course than a crab, which is herbivorous, eats all the grass and digs holes everywhere. What they needed really was a predator. Dr. Wingate discovered the skeleton of that endemic heron in one of the caves he was exploring and sent it away for analysis. And it turned out that it was a descendant, I guess a kind of biological descendant of the yellow-crowned night heron that still lives in Florida. And so he made the decision to bring in yellow-crowned night herons to Bermuda to serve as the predator. They were released onto Nonsuch and have now spread across the island. In fact, if you see a heron today, chances are it's going to be one of those yellow-crowned night herons, by far the most numerous heron we'll see on the island. And they've really gone to work on the land crab population. The debate now, of course, is which is going to come into balance? Are there going to be so many herons that the crab population gets threatened? Or will the opposite come true? Will they manage to balance out? You never know with a biological reintroduction. Is it going to do exactly what you expect, or are things much more complicated?
The sequence of events in an introduction isn't a linear sequence where this affects this affects this. If you imagine it as a spider web, where this affects this, which affects this and that, and this down here. So you can have an introduction that has an effect that can just explode. And there's so many variables, and any ecosystem is so complex that to introduce something you're really gambling. You've got to wonder whether it's worth making any introductions. You know, we like to imagine that we're balancing out our mistakes and the things we've done, and that we can fix them with simple fixes, but simple fixes just don't exist.